Okay, so, well, welcome to our second webinar, which is around questionnaires. And we're having to re-record this. For some reason, the first one didn't record properly. So for those of you who attended it, hopefully you'll remember that we started the webinar around looking at what the problems and advantages are regarding questionnaires. And we asked you to post some of your thoughts in today's meet. Obviously, we're not going to go through that again, but what we will do is start looking at the first sort of part of the questionnaires. And actually, do you want to just say something about the difference between questionnaires and surveys?
Yes. Well, there's often confusion regarding the use of these terms. Some people call them questionnaires, some people call them surveys. I don't think it's necessary to really get too concerned about that. I think technically people talk about a survey being the instrument, the thing you collect the data from. But from our point of view, although these terms are used interchangeably, we're going to deal with them as being the same thing. Essentially a way of capturing data, as you're going to say in a moment, usually from a large group of people.
Yeah, I think that's right. So if we start by looking at the problems or the potential issues of questionnaires, and I think we'll do this because people often think, well, we'll do a questionnaire because it's simple. We'll just write a whole load of questions, send them out, and then it's done. And actually, there's some inherent problems with questionnaires. And not least, probably one of the main ones is the problems of data quality. Because when you send out a questionnaire, you can't always check for accuracy or completeness with the questionnaire. So you're reliant on the answers that people give you, and you can't often follow that up, particularly if the questionnaire was anonymous. So there are sometimes problems associated with data quality. Typically also, you get low response rates with questionnaires unless your audience is a captive audience. And by that I mean, for example, you might have a classroom of students and you might give them the questionnaire to complete during a lesson. That would be a captive audience. But if it's not a captive audience and you're just sending the questionnaire out, you often don't get a lot back. You often get quite low response rates. So if you're trying to get a lot of information from a wide variety of people, questionnaires might not always do what you want it to do. And in conjunction with that is the fact that it's actually quite difficult to motivate people to respond. Unless there's a reason they can see for doing it, that unless they really bought into the concept of what you're asking them the questions about, you often find it that they're not really that motivated to take part in the questionnaire. And then there's this balance that you have between the need to be brief and putting relatively simple questions in, but what you actually want to do is get quite a lot of information back. So there's a balancing act between brevity and simplicity of questions, but actually getting meaningful data back. And that kind of is related to the first point I mentioned, which is around problems of data quality. I suppose another issue with questionnaires is misunderstandings, particularly if you have free text areas. I mean, you can have questionnaires that just ask you to tick yes or no, or do you agree or disagree. But if you have a free text place where people can actually write a response, of course, there could be misunderstanding because what they intended to say is not necessarily what you've understood, and it's very difficult to then clarify that. I think, is there anything else you want to say about that?
No,
okay, yeah. So misunderstandings often can't be corrected. I think it's also difficult to seek information just by asking questions. Sometimes you want more information that they're going to than they actually give you. So building on that last point, they might have put something down which you think you've understood, but you want a little bit more information. Then it's very difficult to follow them up. Again, if it's an anonymized questionnaire. There could be problems with literacy, so people actually don't understand what you've asked, or maybe their literacy that they have themselves is not very good, and so therefore you can't really understand what they're even writing about. And I think sort of in conjunction with that, some people prefer actually to talk than to write. So some people actually, they won't engage in the questionnaire because they don't actually want to write a response. They prefer actually to talk to you about things. And then something which is very hard to overcome really, which is about honesty in questionnaires, because you don't actually know whether the response they're giving you is actually an accurate or an honest answer. They might be giving you the answer you think they think you want to hear. And I suppose that's true really of all data collection methods, isn't it?
Yep. I guess the problem with questionnaires, which make it even more a potential problem, is that sometimes you're not administering the questionnaire face to face.
Yeah.
So if it's being done online, for example, you're not there to actually give them any feedback or to support them.
Yeah. And I suppose there can be some uncertainty as to what happens to that data, and that again is true of all data collection methods. And again, it's because you're not actually there administering the questionnaire, they might feel a little bit unsure about where that data is going to go.
Okay.
Yeah. There's also a lack of control over the context of answering the question. So you don't know whether there's actually somebody else there answering the questionnaire with them that's actually influencing the way they answer that question. And actually the way you word the questions as well can have a major effect on the way people answer the question. So there's a whole range of issues and challenges that you need to consider when you're creating the questionnaire. And it's not as simple as just thinking, okay, I'll write a questionnaire, send it out, and it's done.
Yeah, and I think that's probably a good point to point out, isn't it, that we've got a video here. We've got a link to a YouTube video
We do.
that will demonstrate some of the issues and how you could guard against those.
Yeah.
And you'll need to watch that separately. The link to that is provided in the classroom and in fact in the video itself. Yeah,
we'll put a link to that video on YouTube in the Google Classroom. So after you've watched this video, you can then go and have a look at that.
Yeah. Do you want me to have a look at the advantages?
Just
talk about. So we've looked at the challenges associated with using questionnaires, but of course there are advantages as well. That's why we're discussing this. I think particularly if you're looking at collecting data from a lot of people. So for example, if you wanted to know what a full school, a full class or even a school of children were thinking, a questionnaire is a good way to do it, a lot quicker than doing interviews. The other thing, therefore, is it's probably cheaper. If you've got a lot of data to collect, you're trying to collect from many people, this is going to be cheaper and take less time. There is a benefit as well for the respondents. It's often considered that the respondent has more choice as to when they undertake this activity. So with an interview, they've got to do it when you want to do it. But with a questionnaire, you could leave it with them. It might be a link online, so they can do it at a time that suits them. Also, there are benefits often for participants in terms of answering the questions. So often a questionnaire is fairly straightforward. It's usually closed answers, or a lot of the questions are what we call closed. They can do it quickly. It doesn't take as long as an interview. And of course, the questionnaire can be anonymous. So if you wish, you can decide that the questionnaire does not include names, and that might induce more people to undertake a questionnaire than to undertake an interview. I guess the final points really are, it will reduce what we sometimes refer to as interviewer bias, whereby perhaps unwittingly, when you're doing an interview, some of your assumptions and some of your biases take over, and you ask questions, or you maybe use body language that leads a respondent to a particular type of answer. Even if you're not aware you're doing that, in theory, a questionnaire shouldn't have that inherent problem. And the final point is, one of the great beauties of questionnaires, one of the reasons they were originally developed, is that you can be fairly certain that everybody gets to answer the same question and is asked the same question. And we refer to that as standardization. So for example, in market research, where a company might want to know particular habits of shoppers, we make sure, or they make sure, that the same questions are asked to the same people using a standard set of questions in a questionnaire. So those are some of the benefits.
Yeah, so it's not all bad news. So now we want to talk a little bit about the practicalities of creating a questionnaire and some of the things that you'll need to think about when you come to do your questionnaire. So broadly speaking, questions fall into three different categories. So the first and most obvious is that questions, you can have questions which are about facts. So how old is somebody, what's their gender, what's their nationality. These are all factual questions, and they're often the sorts of questions you'd find at the beginning of a survey or a questionnaire, and we would call it sort of demographic information, and it helps you to understand a little bit more about your cohort, and it allows you to, during analysis, it allows you to come and disaggregate certain groups, so you can just look at females, or just look at males, or just look at people in the over 50 age bracket, for example. And we would call these factual questions that basically look at demographics. The second set of questions are around opinions, beliefs, attitudes, judgments, these sorts of questions. And they're both hard to ask, and they're also difficult to answer. So beliefs are often complex, and the reasons behind why we have certain beliefs are often very difficult for us to unpick. It's quite hard, really, if you haven't already developed an opinion about therefore how to answer that. And particularly if you're asking a question about a belief in what we might call a Likert scale, where you have I strongly agree to I strongly disagree. If it's a 5-point scale, you often find people will come to the middle ground. They're less likely to go for or against, aren't they? So personally, whenever I'm doing these, I prefer to have a 4-point scale, so that people have to either come down positively or negatively around their belief or opinion. And then we have questions which are around behaviour, which are much easier to answer, but as somebody who's analysing them, they're actually sometimes quite hard to make sense of. So those are the three broad categories of questions that you might have in a questionnaire. And then thinking a bit more in detail about how those are framed, we have two types of questions. We have what are called closed questions, where there are predetermined answers, if you like. So, for example, how would you describe your gender? Well, male, female, other, rather not say. So you've got some predetermined answers there. And then there are open questions, which, as you might expect, are the opposite to closed, where you can put free text in there and you can actually write what you like. And these are harder for you to control, and they also require a lot more thought in terms of how you frame them. And I would strongly suggest piloting them. I think we're going to talk about that a little bit later.
I think the other thing about open questions is you need to consider the amount of data that they'll collect, because you're going to have to analyse that data in a different way to a closed question. Closed questions, generally speaking, can be turned into numbers. So if you give people a Likert scale and say it's 1 to 4, 1 is strongly agree and 4 might be strongly disagree, you end up with a series of numbers. And if you're using an electronic version of a survey, this is done automatically for you. So it's all scored. But if you give them an open-ended text, like, please explain your answer, you can't be certain how much or how little people are going to write. So you do need to be careful about using open-ended questions excessively. In fact, I think people would say, if you want to ask a lot of open-ended questions, you're probably better doing interviews, because it's not really a questionnaire.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point. And I suppose that you really need to think about whether you're going for qualitative, quantitative, or both, and what your balance is between the two in that analysis. So that really brings us to the formats, really. And if you're going to use closed questions, then are you going to use boxes for people to fill in? Are you going to ask people to put a tick or a cross? Do you want them to circle or underline words? If you're doing ranking, again, are you going to be using the 5-point scale, the 4-point scale? Are you going to be using letters or numbers in the way you rank the questions? And are you going to use any routing questions? So, for example, if you aren't, questions could ask you something. Do you like spaghetti? If you answer yes, go straight to question 6. If you answer no, go to question 3. This would be, we would call these routing questions. So do you need to include any routing questions in there? And these are all the sorts of things you need to consider. And all I would say is there is one golden rule, and that is be consistent. So if you start asking people to underline words, don't then ask them later on to circle them. If you're going to ask people to put a tick, don't say later on, put a cross. You need to be consistent throughout.
Yeah, I think the only thing I'd add to that, so probably 2 golden rules now,
okay.
is pilot. And I think you might talk about that later, Sarah. But the only way you'll ever know whether these things work is to trial them before you run the full survey or questionnaire. Try it out, do what we call a pilot. Because even with the best will in the world, you think you've looked at every possible outcome or option. It's not until you try it yourself, or you get somebody who hasn't seen it before to try it, that you realise it didn't quite work as I thought. So it's really imperative that you trial it before you do the whole thing.
I think that's really important, and actually it does lead me into my next point, and we're sort of moving now into sort of the design and the administering of the questionnaire, because design is really important, and this is why you need to pilot it. You need to think about how your questionnaire looks. If it looks more attractive, you're more likely to get people responding to it. I know it sounds crazy, but it's absolutely true. And if it's attractive, you'll get more people responding, you'll get more data, and that data will therefore be more meaningful in the analysis. And you need to make sure, you need to think about those people, for example, who might be visually impaired. So is it not only attractive, but is it also accessible to those people who might need to answer it? And then also, how does it work? So for example, if you are using routing questions and you say, please go to question 6, is question 6 the correct question for them to go to? And if you've piloted it, like Kevin suggested, if you've run a pilot, then you should be able to have a look at these things. It's not just about whether it's finding the right information, but it's also about, does it work properly? Is it attractive? Is there anything I can improve on? The other thing that I would consider doing is what we would call topping and tailing. So you would need to find some form of text in order to introduce your survey, or your questionnaire. So the first thing that a person gets is not question 1. There might be a little bit of a paragraph to begin with that says what you're trying to do, why you're collecting the data, what you're going to do with the data. Really importantly, how long is it going to take somebody to fill it in? People want to know how long it's going to take them to do this. And if you do these sorts of things, which we call the topping, the sort of the beginning, the introduction to the questionnaire, you're more likely to get a higher return rate. And as well as doing that bit at the beginning, you also need to do what we call the tailing, the bit at the end. So you need to send a thank you message. So the last page should say, thank you very much. You probably ought to say something about reiterate again what the data is going to be used for, and maybe even put your email address in case people want to contact you after the event and they want to follow any of the questions up with you. You also need to think about how you're going to administer this. So is it going to be online? Are you going to post it as a paper hard copy? Are you going to email it to people? Perhaps you're going to personally deliver it. And then are you going to use a captive group? So a captive group is what we talked about at the beginning. You've got your students in the classroom. Are you going to ask them while they're sat there and there's no escape for them, they have to fill it in?
It's just worth saying perhaps at that point, it is tempting increasingly to use the online version, things like SurveyMonkeys and a whole host of other professional services that work very well, they're very efficient. But there are occasions when they don't work as well as you might have expected. For example, if the internet gives up. So there may be an occasion where you want them to do it, they can't get on the internet, or your internet isn't working. So there are occasions when traditional paper questionnaires are still the best way forwards. And I think it's anticipating who your audience is and what their likelihood or capability is to complete the survey online. That will help you to decide which is the best format.
Yeah, particularly technical capabilities, because we sometimes assume that everybody is tech savvy, and actually there's a lot of people that really aren't and would find it quite difficult to complete an online survey and even be a little bit nervous about doing that. So yeah, definitely thinking about the audience and their capability is really important. So the other things probably to say are, when you've administered your survey or questionnaire, or prior to administering it, you need to set a date by when you expect them all to be back in. People need to know how long they've got in order to complete the questionnaire that you're sending them. And then you need to think about, when you're not getting very many back, about how you remind people. And generally speaking, I think you need to do this very gently and very politely, often highlighting to them sort of the advantages of doing this, how important their particular feedback is to you, and how you really value their contribution, making them feel worthwhile and valued as a person for filling the questionnaire in for you. And I probably wouldn't send more than 1 or 2 reminders either. People don't like to be constantly told to do something. You might also want to think about identity. Is this an anonymous questionnaire? Is it truly anonymous? And if it's not, how are you going to store people's names and contact details if that's the sort of information you've asked from them? And at this point, I would strongly recommend that you go and have a look. We did a webinar on ethics and research integrity. I would strongly recommend that you go and have a look at that. And we also uploaded some forms for you to fill in to help you think about ethical issues and research integrity in line with your research. So that brings us really to the final points. We've talked about the pilot. What else do we need to talk about? Bias. We've talked a little bit about bias already, haven't we? So really thinking about your own bias and trying to think about how much of your own opinions are you putting into the questions, and how much of them are being, more standalone is the wrong word. I can't think of the word, Kevin. If you're not being biased, you're being subjective.
More subjective.
Yeah, more subjective, perhaps. Yeah, there's another word, I can't think of it at the minute.
No, objective.
Objective. I don't know. Anyway,
Okay.
the other thing is about questionnaires can easily become very long very quickly. So you need to be very clear about why you're putting a question in. So when you're rereading a draft of the questionnaire, as you read each question, think about, is that question really necessary? What's it going to tell me? And how is it going to help me answer my research question? And if it's not really going to do any of those things, then don't put the question in, because you're just making the questionnaire longer and longer for no reason. And really try and keep it simple. Simplicity is the order of the day. Try and keep the sentences simple. If a sentence is too long, can you split it into more than one sentence? And also make sure there aren't questions within questions. And that's a trap that people often fall into, is asking more than one question within a question. So if you keep the sentences very simple and very short, then you should be able to avoid that.
Very nice.
Is there anything else you can think of that we need to cover?
No, I think we've covered the main reasons for doing a questionnaire or survey, or whatever you want to cover, call it rather. Some of the benefits, we've looked at some of the drawbacks, we've looked at issues of how to organise it, some of the logistical issues. And again, as with all these presentations, it's about making sure that you've identified what's most appropriate for your research question. So don't feel you have to do a questionnaire simply because it's what everybody else is doing or it sounds good. It really has to be appropriate for your research question. What do you want to find out? And is a questionnaire the best way to collect that data?
Yeah, that's it. Okay. Well, we're online if you need us to answer any questions. Thanks very much.